Okay, my presentation is on finding your military ancestors, or if you know who they are, finding their records. I'll start out for those who weren't in the military. I'll give some background here. The current branches of the U.S. military are the National Guard, the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the Marines, the Coast Guard, and now the Space Force. The National Guard predates the American Revolution and the beginning of the U.S. military. Prior to 1947, the Air Force was a branch of the U.S. Army known as the Army Air Force. I once sat next to an ex-Marine at work, and when I reminded him that the Marines were part of the Navy, he quipped that it was the best part. There are branches of, prior to 1901, women could not serve in the US military in any official capacity. Women were so indispensable as nurses during the Spanish-American War in 1898 that the US Army Nurse Corps was set up in 1901 and the Navy followed in 1908. It was not until the Second World War, though, that the WACs, the WAVES, and the other auxiliary women's branches of the services were set up. Finally, 2 years after the end of the Vietnam War, President Carter integrated women into the regular branches of the service. Now, how do you say Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines in other languages? Well, Army appears to have been a French word. The word for Navy in both French and German is marine, a word we use in English to have a slightly different meaning. The same goes for aviation, a French word for Air Force. The Italians seem to have given up when it comes to Air Force and Marines, and they just use the English words, or at least that's what Google Translate says. When Queen Elizabeth I of England defeated the Spanish Armada in 1588, it quite literally meant the Spanish Navy. And if you watch World War II movies or documentaries, the German Army is always referred to as the German Army, but the Air Force has always been referred to as the Luftwaffe. And finally, the Germans had it right when they referred to the Marines as the Marines Soldaten, literally meaning Navy soldiers. Now, in the military, military ranks are divided into officers and enlisted personnel. I'm sure you've all heard of that. And in the U.S. Army today, there are approximately, or almost exactly, 6 enlisted persons to every officer. Back in Vietnam, someone told me, back in the Vietnam days when I was in the Navy, someone told me that the ratio was 7 to 1. Enlisted persons have a specific job function, while the officers plan, lead, and give orders. The senior enlisted personnel, sergeants and chief petty officers, give orders to the junior enlisted personnel. You may not be so familiar with the term warrant officer, considering that they only make up about 2% of the armed forces. My simplistic distinction between the two was always that commissioned officers could pilot jet aircraft while warrant officers piloted the helicopters. But mainly warrant officers serve mainly as technical experts. And the truth is, the whole time I was in the Navy, I don't think I ever met a warrant officer. But I remember walking down the passageway once and passing the warrant officer's wardroom. And so I asked somebody on the ship, "What's a warrant officer?" Okay, now surprisingly, the ranks of commissioned officers has remained relatively static over time. The Navy hierarchy, on the other hand, was established during the Civil War. The Army, Air Force, and Marines are uniform in their description of the different ranks, while the Navy has slightly different names. Most notably, a captain in the Navy is 3 pay grades higher than a captain in the other services. A captain in the Navy can command an entire aircraft carrier. Smaller ships are usually commanded by commanders, and in the case of a World War II PT boat, if you remember Lieutenant Commander McHale in the 1960s sitcom McHale's Navy. There are 9 pay grades in the enlisted ranks. E8 and E9 came about in 1958 when they decided to do away with the two warrant officer ranks. Well, that proved to be a mistake, and in 1963 they reinstated the warrant officer ranks. Only now they have more of them, and they also were stuck with E8s and E9s. Now, I know this is a lot to take in, so let's go to the next slide. When back in the day, things were a lot simpler. If you go back to the Civil War, there were just 4 enlisted ranks. The ones I mostly learned by watching the adventures of Rin Tin Tin back in the 1950s at Fort Apache, where you had Major Swanson, Lieutenant Rip Masters, Sergeant O'Hara, Corporal Boone, Honorary Corporal Rusty, who was a boy, and Private Rin Tin Tin. And for those of you not alive in the 1950s, Rusty was a boy and Rin Tin Tin was a German Shepherd. The Navy enlisted ranks were complicated before the 1890s. Seniority was based on job title, not on time or rank. And so they had a second captain of the mainmast and a second captain of the foremast and a second captain of the muzzle mast, and they all were ranked according to their job title, and the gunner's mate and all this stuff. There haven't been any mates since the 1890s, by the way. Except in name, they'll have like pharmacist mate or whatever. But those are the job functions as opposed to the rank. Now, there's some Navy jargon that I put up here that probably have heard the terms and never really knew what they were. So a boatswain is in charge of the ship's rigging, anchors, cables, and deck crew. The quartermaster is the petty officer responsible for steering the ship. The coxswain is the ship's helmsman, steers the ship's boats, and is in charge of the crew. Now, I want to say something about ships and boats. You know, you always talk about your ancestors getting off the boat. Well, actually, they came over on the Atlantic on a ship. They anchor the ship, then you get into a boat, and then you make your way to the pier in the boat. The master at arms is responsible for the ship's discipline. A yeoman performs secretarial and clerical duties. Mess attendants serve food to the officers and crew. Food is served on the mess deck to the enlisted personnel. Food is served in a wardroom to the officers. Most other terms are self-explanatory, like machinist mate, pharmacist mate, musicians. And first mate went out with the 1890s and the ships that had the sailing ships, basically. Now, if you want to know where the record collections are, on Ancestry.com, this is where you find it in the card catalog. You want to go up to where it says search right here and go down to military. You could go to the card catalog and filter on military, but they got one here that'll take you right to the military catalog. And there are 1,294 different record collections. The more records in the collection, the more likely it is that you will find one of your ancestors. A lot of them will show up as hints when you build out your family tree. In other cases, you may want to try to go to a direct search, as the artificial intelligence algorithm used is not perfect and may suggest records that are not your ancestor, and will miss they'll miss some other records. Military catalog. You can filter on country. Most of the records are from the United States, but there are a lot of records from other countries as well. And since we're a nation of immigrants, most of us have ancestors who came from other countries. MyHeritage.com also has military record collections. I didn't see the French military death index on Ancestry, although I have no French ancestors, but Ancestry does have twice as many collections as MyHeritage does. Okay, before you start delving into your ancestors, you might want to become familiarized with all the wars that we've had. And we could start with Prince Philip's War, or the First Indian War back in the 1600s. Actually, there have been 40 American Indian Wars from 1622 to 1890, according to the 1894 US Census estimate. That was followed by Queen Anne's War. France ceded to Great Britain, Arcadia, Newfoundland, Hudson's Bay, and St. Kitts after that war. Then came the French and Indian War, known as the 7 Years' War in Europe. And at the end of that war, France ceded all of New France, basically Canada, to Great Britain, which would also include the 13 American colonies. And then came the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, the Mexican War, the American Civil War between the North and the South, the Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Persian Gulf War, the Afghanistan War, and the Iraq War. And so one of the reasons you want to know this is because if you know what the birth date of your ancestor is, you can determine whether he might have been a soldier in one of these wars. Also, notice the ratio of dead to wounded in the Civil War versus the ratio in Iraq and Afghanistan. If you were wounded during the Civil War, there was a good chance you would suffer and die I should say there was as good a chance that you would suffer and die on the battlefield as you would have if you were wounded, because they didn't have the medical facilities they got today. Now I'm going to apologize in advance for skipping over 39 of the 40 wars with Native Americans. Queen Anne's War, the War of 1812, the Mexican War, the Spanish-American War, and the Korean War, because I only have an hour. Okay, so contrary to the way it sounds, King Philip is not a reference to the King of England, but it was a nickname of the Wampanoag Indian chief Metacom, who led a confederation of Indian tribes against the New England colonists in a last-ditch effort to kill or drive every European settler off the North American continent, or at least those in New England. However, it wasn't unanimous. The Mohawks actually fought with the colonists. There is no single repository for pre-Revolutionary War records at the federal level. You will find them in local libraries and state archives, mostly in the states that make up the original 13 colonies. That's bad news if you're researching from Wisconsin. The good news is that if you can take your ancestors back to the 1600s and 1700s, these people now have so many descendants in the United States that if there was something to be found, somebody has probably found it and posted it to Ancestry.com. Take Joseph Ford, my sister-in-law's 9th great-grandfather. A little scrap of information was found on him in a genealogy written by someone back in 1897, and about his role in King Philip's War. The 7 Years' War, I should say, Winston Churchill called the 7 Years' War the First World War. Those of us in North America associate it with the British conquest of Canada, though French Quebec still lives on to this day. The war started in the Ohio Valley as a young 22-year-old George Washington engaged with French troops trying to establish their authority. The war quickly spread to engulf much of the world between the years of 1756 and 1763, as the military powers of the day aligned themselves either behind Great Britain or France. Despite the fact that none of my direct ancestors came to the United States before 1843, I did find an ancestor I believe fought with Frederick the Great of Prussia during the war. In fact, there are indications he was already a military man before the war. Not only that, but the records were not found in one of the military collections, but in the birth, death, and marriage category. There is the Garrison Church in Potsdam, Brandenburg, Prussia, was the parish and regimental church of the Prussian royal family. And two of my fifth great-grandfather's children were baptized there, one in 1750 before the war, and one in 1759 during the war. The king's regiments are listed under the author. So in 1750, it looks like Regiment 35, and in 1759, it looks like there was the Regiment 6, 15, and 18, and they tended to fight together. And those three regiments were the only ones that actually had names other than Regiment 6 or 15. Now, there's a website out there that lists all the Prussian regiments and has them coded. All the battles that each Prussian regiment fought in during the period from 1756 to 1763. So picking one at random, it's likely that my fifth great-grandfather was at the Battle of Leuthen in 1757, and he survived to father a child in 1759. Here, the Prussians engaged in a battle with the Austrians to maintain control over Breslau in Silesia, which is now Wrocław, Poland, since 1945, as Silesia was lost during the Second World War. And there was a famous painting by Karl Roschling. And so you can see what the uniforms look like of the Prussians back then. Okay, now we go to the American Revolution. And I have a second great-grandmother who came from the German kingdom of Hessen. And sometimes I wonder if I have an ancestor that fought on the side of the British during the American Revolution. Well, that wouldn't get my sister into the Daughters of the American Revolution. Now, speaking of the Daughters of the American Revolution, that can be a good source of information. Mrs. Elizabeth Strain Richards, member number 148598, is a descendant of my fifth great-granduncle, Lieutenant David Sloan. Although my second great-grandmother from Northern Ireland didn't immigrate to the United States until 1854, other members of her mother's family did immigrate a lot earlier. Lieutenant Sloan was killed in the Battle of Long Island, New York, but his widow received a 200-acre war bounty land grant in 1787 as payment for services rendered by her husband during the Revolutionary War. In most cases, American soldiers were either paid in continental dollars that became worthless due to inflation, or could not be paid at all, but they were promised free land by the federal and state governments if they won the war. Claims could be filed up until 1856. Veterans could also apply for a disability pension in accordance with the Acts of 1818 and 1820 after the War of 1812. Here, my third cousin, 6 times removed, Private Samuel Sloan, applied for a disability pension in 1826. There were no forms as we know them today, so the request came in the form of letters written, and affidavits were required to prove that you served in a military unit during the Revolutionary War, as documentation during the war between 1775 and 1783 was often lacking. After he died in 1840, there was another application was filed by his widow for a widow's pension, where it said that she was blind. So obviously, I think somebody else must have written it then, if that was the case. Okay, the Civil War. Civil War armies were organized top down by corps, division, brigade, and regiment, right down to the company level. A company consisted of 100 men. A full company consisted of 100 men. A full regiment consisted of 10 companies or 1,000 men. Companies were assigned the letters A through K, with the exception of J because it looked too much like an I. As a genealogist, you are going to want to know what company and regiment your ancestor was in. One place you can look, assuming your Civil War ancestor was still alive in 1890 and wasn't killed during the war, one place to look is the special schedule in the 1890 US Census. This schedule appears to have survived the 1890 fire that took place in 1921, as I am able to see that my second great-grandmother's brother, John Russell, was a sergeant major in a 90-day regiment that formed up in Peoria, Illinois in 1861. He enlisted as a private on the first day, and a day later he was made a sergeant major with no known experience other than perhaps he was in an orange militia back in the north of Ireland. After 90 days, he never re-enlisted. Another way to find your ancestors' company and regiment is to visit the cemetery. Most veterans of the Civil War will have their regiment and company chiseled on their tombstone. The blackened stone of my second great-grandfather, Gulick Eggleston, also the second great-grandfather of Chuck Johnson, who is on this call, was replaced with a nice new white one by the sons of Union veterans of the Civil War a few years back. The pictures were taken by Chuck Johnson. As it happens that I'm in one of these pictures, I happen to be that person right there. There are also books in the library entitled The State Adjutant General's Reports for the Civil War for each state. I know there's one for Wisconsin in the Waterford Public Library in the local history reading room. I assume there's one in the Racine Public Library as well. Is that correct, Darcy? Here is a hint. They are online now too. They will give you an entire account of the activities of every regiment that fought in the war. So if you know your ancestors' company and regiment and the dates of service, you can follow their activities throughout the war. Now, the Civil War was the first U.S. war in which men were conscripted. Now, conscription was something that took place during the Napoleonic Wars in France back in the early 1800s. But for the U.S., they conscripted men starting in 1863. And during the Civil War, a rich man could hire a substitute for $300, which comes to about $25,000 in today's money. My father was 21 in 1941, and he received a draft notice that September. My grandfather told him not to open it, but to take it down to the Naval Recruiting Office, and they swore him in. I was a big loser in the 1969 draft lottery, numbers 31 out of 366. When my last student deferment was about to expire, I joined the Navy 2 weeks before I would have received my draft notice in 1971. I had already passed the pre-induction physical the prior month. There has not been a draft since 1973, near the end of the Vietnam War. But during the Civil War, men ages 20 to 45 were required to register for the draft. The draft registration documents are a valuable source of genealogical information, even if your ancestor never served in the military. Take my second great-grandfather, Frederick Japp, who had to register at the age of 44 during the Civil War. I would never have known that he was born in England, considering he immigrated to the United States from Pomerania, Prussia, with the first of his 3 German wives. I would question if this was not a mistake, except for the fact that the only Jap DNA matches that I can find were from people who lived in Scotland. I didn't want to go here yet. So you might ask, where are all the military records, veterans' pension records, and bounty land warrant records kept? Can you get copies of them? Well, the answer is you can find them at the National Archives, www.archives.gov. And you'll want to click on Veteran Service Records. However, due to COVID-19, you might have to wait a while. There are 3 sets of pre-1912 military records that you might want to obtain from the NARA in Washington, D.C. 1, compiled service records, which is basically an accumulation of all the different types of records that were generated while the person was in service. 2, a pension application and payment records, if they exist. And 3, bounty land records relating to Revolutionary War and War of 1812 applications. Now there's a problem. Now we have a problem. Well, there was a little problem with a fire at the National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis in 1973, where 75 to 80% of all Army discharges from 1912 to 1960 and Air Force to 1964 records were destroyed. That would cover World War I, World War II, and Korea. Records prior to 1912 are kept at the NARA in Washington, D.C., so they were left untouched. And then, of course, we also have the COVID-19 problem right now. So there could be a delay there too. Now, they don't charge for these records, but they will charge for the pre-1912 records. Now, pertaining to the records in St. Louis, this might be your final obstacle. The records are only available to veterans or their next of kin if the discharge, retirement date, or date of death in service is less than 62 years ago. So for 2021, that would be 1959. So forget about Vietnam or any records since right now. What, Debbie?
Hang on, sorry. A student was just leaving. I didn't catch that.
Oh.
What? I'm sorry. What did you say?
Oh, I said that if the records are from 1959 on, you or in the year from the year 2021, If the records are from 1959 on, you can't get them unless you're a veteran or a next of kin.
Right, right. Okay. Yeah, I'd heard that. I just didn't know why you were saying my name.
Oh,
Sorry.
okay. So there are two applications. I have images here for the applications that you would fill out to get compiled military records. And since you're sending the application to two different places, depending on what year you're going after, there are two different forms. Now I see on the first form, they've got a checkbox for cavalry, which you probably wouldn't find in the second form. But on the first form, you can see at the bottom that there is a room for a credit card number for the pre-1912 records. There's a reproduction fee of $30. Then you would get a nice PDF you can download to your computer electronically. You can also opt for a CD/DVD or a paper record, but the electronic transfer PDF file is the best, I would say. They will not charge you anything if they don't find anything. And they might not find anything if you if you don't have enough information, or if you use a name that the person used. For example, my second great grandfather, Gulick Ingelson Clevin, enlisted as Gulick with one L, and Eggleston, which is kind of a butchering of Eagleson. And so I never would have found him if it didn't have his Civil War name on his tombstone. Then there is another form, and this one would only go to the NARA for federal pensions or bounty land warranties. And there is also a charge for that. In fact, some of these pension records can go over 100 copies, I believe. And so they're going to charge you $80 for the first 100 pages and 70 cents for each additional page. And you can opt for the smaller packet for $30. I forget how many copies you get for $30, but my Civil War ancestors' pension records was only 11 pages, so I think that would have fit under the 30. Now this is what a part of a compiled military record looks like for the Civil War. So so you can see that he enlisted at the age of 33. He volunteered at the age of 33 and mustered in Milwaukee on the 31st of March, 1862 for a term of 3 years. And by August, he was sick in the hospital. More soldiers died from disease during the Civil War than actually died in combat. Mostly from things like dysentery and contagious diseases that passed around to farm boys who weren't exposed to this stuff. Then, in 1889, here is the top of the legal form that he filled out when he made his declaration for an original invalid pension at the age of 62. According to this, he suffered a strain to his right arm near Richmond, Virginia, in February of 1865 while leading a horse to water. That sounds like a likely story, but I don't know how the government could prove or disprove it, or that you could prove or disprove it. In the next few years, he got affidavits from his neighbors supporting the claim that he had trouble using his right arm and that he could no longer farm, and a pension was granted. In 1907, the government dispensed with all the claims that could not be proved and just issued pensions to any surviving Civil War veteran who applied. records of service from countries other than the United States can be found on Ancestry.com, as I showed you before. And here's a copy of the attestation my great-grandmother's nephew made when he joined the Canadian Overseas Expeditionary Force in the service of King George IV during the First World War, and was sent to France. And I like the part on there where it says, are you willing to be vaccinated? And I guess he said yes. But he was born in Spokane, Washington, and his family immigrated to, his father was born in Peoria, Illinois, and they immigrated to Washington State, where in the 1880s, where he was born in Spokane, and then in 1896, the family immigrated to British Columbia. And so that's how he became a Canadian. My grandfather's 3 brothers were drafted during World War I. Stanley Arthur and Clarence Howe. They lived in Racine. After the war, Stanley became a medical doctor. Arthur helped pave Highway 20 from Racine to Rochester in 1919 to 1920 before working for the gas company. And it was the only paved highway in Racine County, other than a stretch between Waterford and Wind Lake, which they also paved. And Clarence, he became an attorney for the VA after the war. There's a book entitled Racine. There's a book in the Racine, Waterford, and Burlington public libraries entitled Racine County in the World War, A History by Walter L. Haight, published by the Racine Western Publishing and Lithography Company in 1920. And it gave the Army units of my grandfather's 3 brothers. As you can see, Stanley here was sent to France, and he was in the artillery. Arthur was also sent to France, and Clarence, he never got out of the United States. Now, here's the draft registration for my grandfather, Raymond John Miller. And despite his occupational deferment, since he was a machinist in a gun factory, he joined the Navy anyway because he said the cops would stop him on the street in Milwaukee where he lived and ask him how come he wasn't in uniform. Well, next came World War II, a couple of generation later. And my grandfather had to register for the draft for a second time. There was something called the old man draft registration. There's a lot of good information on here, even though probably nobody from this age group, 45 to 65, was ever drafted in the United States. If you were German, that was another story, but at any rate, there's his, you can find information on Ancestry.com on the old man draft. And then there was the young man draft. Find my father on that one. And I told you a story about that already. Well, now, if you look in his compiled military service record, there's a record that shows his summary of service. That's assuming it didn't get burned up in the fire. And it lists the dates that my father was on certain duties at certain duty stations or on the battleship USS North Carolina. He was on the battleship North Carolina from December 9th, 1941 to February 16th, 1943. My father tells the story about how he arrived in New York, and on December 7th, 1941, he was in Times Square, and he was in a movie theater. And when they came out, he looked up at that electronic banner that was going across with the news, and it said the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor and that everybody should report to their ship. And then somebody told him, "Oh, well, don't worry about it. Your ship is in dry dock. It's not going anyplace. You can report to your ship tomorrow." So he said he ducked in a bar. Well, as you can see, he was a musician. Now, based on this and stories that he told, his battleship was attacked by a Japanese submarine. By torpedo, and the aircraft carrier USS Wasp was also hit by a Japanese submarine, and it sank. And this was in the South Pacific. And those are official U.S. Navy photos. He didn't take them. And then my uncle was also in the military during World War II, and he was in the Army, in the Big Red One, and he was sent to Europe. He got there after D-Day, and he was wounded in the Hurtgen Forest. On Thanksgiving Day in 1944, and as a result, he missed the Battle of the Bulge, and he credits that as the reason why he survived the war, and he rejoined his unit in March of 1945, and they met the Russians at the Elbe, and he said he ended up in Czechoslovakia the day the war ended. Well, my dad and my uncle also had a second cousin whom they never met and probably never knew about. And I didn't find out about him until after I was working on my family tree, and I came across one of my third cousins from Germany who had moved to Australia. Well, anyhow, his my father and uncle's second cousin Siegfried lived in an area of Germany that's now in Poland. He died on the Eastern Front in Ukraine and the Soviet Union in August of 1943, where the big tank battle at Kursk took place in July and August. And from his uniform, it appears that before the war, he had been a musician like my father. Now, they never met, but in 1943, it says he was in a Panzer Grenadier Regiment 128. Panzers are German tanks. So he was in a tank division. And anyhow, there was a record of this on the internet. You can view the image. It's in German. So now, after that, we come to Vietnam, the Gulf War, the Iraq War, and Afghanistan. Not to mention all the other little conflicts that have taken place, like Cuba, the Dominican Republic, the Arab-Israeli wars, Iran, El Salvador, Lebanon, Grenada, Libya, Panama, Somalia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Kosovo, and ISIS in Syria and Iraq. And by the way, if you go before 1960, there are a lot of conflicts that took place that you probably never heard of, that you can look up, and your military ancestors might have taken place in some of those. Now you're saying, well, geez, can I find anything on anybody anything that took place after 1959? Well, you can, because lots of the veterans are still living, for one thing. And secondly, there's one thing I want to show you. It's called there are US Navy cruise books out there at this website right here. And if you go to that website, you will see that there are 1,850 Navy cruise books online available to look through electronically. It's great. And so let's take the USS Independence, for example. That was the ship I was on. Nancy's ex-father-in-law was also on that ship, Commander William Arnold Jr. Now, he was in the squadron VAW 33 Nighthawk. Now, that squadron was on board the Independence during the 1963-1964 Mediterranean cruise. Although from Nancy, I'm not sure that he was in that squadron at that time, but he was on the ship at that time. And he might have been ship's company. Now, we're not sure of the timeline here. But at any rate, when he did go through flight school, he became a backseat WSO weapons support officer. And he sat in the back seat here of one of these planes, and they did early detection to, you know, the squadron of planes are sent out. You want to know that the enemy is approaching you. A plane has to have radar, you know, where you can detect this kind of thing. Then, during the USS Independence CV-62 Mediterranean cruise in 1974 and 75, I was on that ship at that time. You can see my picture in the book right here, Air Controlman Second Class D. Miller. And that's me. I haven't changed a bit. Cruise books show life on board, military actions, ports of call. And most books have pictures of the personnel, but they all don't. And with the squadrons, it was kind of hit or miss. So back in the 1963-64 cruise book, they didn't have pictures of the crew in there. They had pictures of them, but they didn't have any names under them, and they didn't show everybody. You know, they would just show an officer standing by his jet, and, you know, plane captain, you know, next to the plane doing some maintenance or something. So, but anyway, if one of your ancestors or one of your relatives was on a ship, you might want to look at the book and see whether you can find them. And I mean, these cruise books go almost all the way up to the present. And that is my presentation.